On the 27th of December, 1836, at 10:15 in the morning, a wall of snow, 20 feet thick, broke away from the lip of a chalk hill above a small street in Lewes, in East Sussex, and fell 330 feet onto 7 cottages below. In seconds, a row of homes that had stood for a working generation simply ceased to exist above ground. 8 people did not come home that day. 7 more were pulled from beneath the snow alive. One of them, a boy of 14, who was not reached until 7 hours later. There was no earthquake. There was no flood, no fire, no war. There was only a hillside, a fortnight of relentless snow, and a street of poor families who had been told, days before, to leave, and who mostly did not. To understand how an ordinary morning 2 days after Christmas became one of the strangest and most quietly devastating disasters in English history, you have to go back to the town itself, to the hill that stood over it, and to a man named Robert Hyam, who went from door to door along that street and begged its people to walk away from their own homes. Before we go on, this channel is only just getting started, and stories like this one are exactly what it is built around. If you would like more forgotten corners of British history told properly, take a moment to subscribe so the next one reaches you, and drop a comment letting me know where in the world you're watching from. It always makes for good reading. Lewes in the autumn of 1836 was a modest county town built along the curve of the River Ouse, the kind of place that mattered more than its size suggested. It held the assizes for the county, so the law itself passed through it several times a year. It had a market that drew farmers and traders from across the surrounding downs, a scattering of timber yards and breweries, and the ordinary trades of a working English town. Coopers, carters, labourers, washerwomen, small tradesmen who lived close to the edge of hardship, even in a good year. It was not a wealthy town, and it was not meant to look picturesque from below. It was meant to work. At the eastern edge of the town, where the streets gave way to open ground, stood Cliffe Hill, a steep chalk rise a little over 500 feet high, its face cut sharply enough that anyone standing at its foot would have felt its height pressing over them. At the base of that hill, tucked hard against the chalk, ran a short row of 7 cottages known locally as Boulder Row on South Street. These were not grand houses. They were the kind of cheap, close-built housing that filled the ground nobody else wanted, because the ground beneath a hillside cliff, in an ordinary year, cost less to build on and less to live on. In an ordinary year, that arrangement worked well enough. 1836 was not an ordinary year. The families who lived in Boulder Row were labouring people, the sort of households the historical record rarely names in full, because no one thought to write down the daily business of the poor. What the record does preserve, clearly and specifically, is the one fact that explains almost everything that followed. For these families, leaving Boulder Row did not simply mean finding a friend's spare room or paying for a night at an inn. It meant, in practice, the workhouse. And the workhouse, in 1836 England, was not merely unpleasant. It meant the loss of independence, the separation of families, and a stigma that could follow a household for years. People avoided it unless they were, in the word used at the time, desperate. That single fact sits at the centre of this story, because it explains a choice that otherwise looks inexplicable. A choice to stay inside a home that a neighbour was actively warning them to leave. That neighbour was Robert Hyam. The record gives us little about his occupation or his standing in the town, only that he was a local man who, in the day or so before the 27th of December, went along Boulder Row, urging its residents to get out. He did not simply mention the danger and move on. Among at least 2 women in the row, he is recorded as having taken them physically by the arm and tried to walk them out of their own front doors. Some residents heeded him. Others, weighing his warning against the reality of where they would go instead, chose to stay in their homes. It is worth sitting with that for a moment, because it is not a story of a warning that went unheard. It is a story of a warning that was heard clearly and weighed against an impossible alternative by people who had almost nothing to weigh it with. Among the roughly 15 people who would be inside those 7 cottages on the morning of the 27th were children as young as 2 and adults into their 80s. William Gear was 82 years old, the oldest person in the row. Phoebe Barnden was 45. Mary Taylor was 42. Susan Hayward was 34. A woman recorded as Maria, or M.A. Bridgman was 28. Jane Boakes was 25. Joseph Wood was 15. Mary Bridgman was 11 years old. 2 doors along, 14-year-old John Bridgman lived with his own family. And in the same row, a woman named Fanny Sherlock cared for her 2-year-old granddaughter, Fanny Boakes. A young labourer named Jeremiah Rook also had his home there. This was not an abstraction, a community, in the way that word gets used to smooth over the individual people inside it. It was these people in these 7 small houses going about an ordinary week between Christmas and the New Year. That week itself had already made itself known. The winter of 1836 into 1837 would go on to be remembered as one of the harshest in living memory across Britain, and Lewes had begun to feel it in the days immediately before Christmas. Snow arrived not as a gentle covering, but as a driven, accumulating weight, carried sideways by gale-force wind that did not let up. By Christmas Eve, the wind was already piling snow into drifts exceeding 10 feet in sheltered corners of the town. It was, by any account, no longer simply cold. It was becoming dangerous in ways that had not yet been named. It was a cornice that formed above Boulder Row, not a drift in the ordinary sense. Wind does not simply deposit snow evenly across open ground. Where a hill meets a steep drop, wind hollows the snow away from the windward face and piles it, overhanging, along the leeward edge, the same way a wave curls over before it breaks. On the exposed lip above Boulder Row, that overhang grew through Christmas Eve and Christmas Day until it stood roughly 20 feet deep, a shelf of packed wind-hardened snow projecting out over open air above the cottages below. It was not visible from the street in the way a falling rock might be. It sat above the sightline of anyone standing at their own front door, an unstable mass held up only by its own compacted weight and the frozen crust binding it together. On the evening before the collapse, there had already been a sign that the hill was shedding its weight. Witnesses saw snow sliding from higher ground into a nearby timber yard, a smaller, earlier fall that did no harm and drew little comment beyond the ordinary talk of a hard winter. In hindsight, it reads as the clearest possible warning. The hillside was already moving. At the time, it most likely read as nothing more than a curiosity, the kind of thing a hard winter produces, and a town shrugs off by the next morning. There was no institution in Lewes whose job it was to read that fall as a signal. There was no council surveyor for hillside stability, no regulation requiring anyone to inspect the cliff above a row of homes, because nothing like it had ever been asked of anyone in that town, or in most towns in England, in 1836. This was not a case of a report ignored or a corner cut by a company chasing a saving. There was no company here, no colliery owner, no landlord cutting costs on a roof. The failure, if it can be called that, belonged to nobody and to everybody. A poor town built hard against a hill because the ground was cheap in a country that had not yet begun to ask whether some ground was too dangerous to build on at all. That is worth being precise about, because this disaster does not follow the shape of most the record keeps. There is no ledger of blame to open, no boardroom decision, no falsified inspection to uncover later. The nearest thing to an institutional decision at all was the one Robert Hyam tried to force into being on his own initiative, walking 100 yards of narrow street and asking, house by house, for people to leave. He was, in effect, the only warning system Boulder Row had, and even he could not overrule what those families were weighing on the other side of the scale, consider what staying actually meant to them, and what leaving actually meant. To stay was to remain in a home you knew, with your own possessions, your own bed, your own fire, in a town where you had, however precariously, a place. To leave in the depth of a Sussex winter, with gale winds still blowing, meant presenting yourself and your children at the workhouse door, submitting to its rules, its separations, its record of who had fallen and who had not. For many of the poorest people in early 19th century England, the workhouse was not a shelter. It was the last resort, the place you went when every other option had failed, and going there voluntarily, ahead of any actual catastrophe, on the strength of one neighbour's warning about snow on a hill, was a very different kind of decision than it looks like now, with the ending already known. It is easy, from a distance of nearly 2 centuries, to ask why anyone would stay. It is much harder and much more honest to sit with the facts that the choice these families made was not foolish. It was rational, given what the 2 options actually cost them. That is the flaw at the centre of this disaster. Not a broken machine or a falsified certificate, but a town too poor to give its people anywhere safer to go. Christmas Day itself passed inside those cottages, much as it would have anywhere else in England that year, adjusted for what a family in Boulder Row could actually afford. There would have been little in the way of luxury. What there was kept and treasured precisely because there was not much of it. Later, amid the wreckage, searchers would find pieces of cake and plum pudding, tangled with holly and other greenery, brought in to mark the season, described afterwards as bitter memorials of the festivity of Christmas. That detail belongs here before the disaster, not after it, because it tells you what these homes looked like on the ordinary day that came before the extraordinary one. They were decorated. There was pudding put by, cake kept for later, holly still tacked up over a doorway or a mantle. These were not people living in visible desperation. They were people who had, within their means, made a Christmas. The temperature did not rise in the 2 days that followed. If anything, the cold deepened and the wind kept working at the hill above them, adding weight to a shelf of snow that was already carrying more than it could hold. Nobody in Boulder Row could see the underside of that cornice from their own doorstep. Nobody had the means to measure it, or the training to know what 20 feet of wind-packed snow, unsupported along one whole edge, was capable of doing once gravity finally won the argument it had been having with the frozen crust for 2 days. It is useful at this point to understand exactly what that kind of collapse looks like in physical terms, because it explains why what happened next was so fast and why there was so little any single resident could have done differently on the morning itself, whatever they had decided 2 days earlier. A cornice does not slide the way loose snow slides down a slope. It breaks the way a shelf of ice breaks from the edge of a roof, and once it separates from the hillside, it does not slow down as it falls. It gathers speed for the entire length of its drop, arriving at the ground not as settling snow, but as a moving mass with the weight and force of the fall behind it. 330 feet is not a small distance to fall. It is roughly the height of a 30-story building, dropped in one motion, arriving at the bottom still carrying almost all the speed it gathered on the way down. That is the detail that separates this disaster from an ordinary heavy snowfall or an ordinary hard winter. Snow that falls from the sky settles. Snow that falls from a height as a single collapsing mass behaves like almost anything else that falls from a height. It strikes. None of the 7 households in Boulder Row had any reason to expect the collapse at that specific hour on that specific morning, even those who had weighed Robert Hyam's warning and chosen, in the end, to stay. A warning that danger exists in general is a very different thing from a warning that danger will arrive at 10:15 on the morning of the 27th. Nobody could have given them that. Even the men who would later dig through the wreckage with their bare hands and borrowed shovels could not have told you, on the morning before, exactly when the hill above them would let go. The morning of the 27th began the way every morning in Boulder Row began that week, with the business of simply staying warm and getting through a hard season. Fires were built up from whatever fuel each household had put by. Water had to be fetched and probably broken free of ice first. In the Bridgman household, 14-year-old John was awake and moving about the house, in the ordinary manner of a boy of that age with chores to do and a cold morning to do them in. 2 doors down, Fanny Sherlock had her small granddaughter, 2-year-old Fanny Boakes, in her care, as she likely was most mornings, the child probably still within reach of the hearth. Jeremiah Rook, the young labourer, would have had a day's work in front of him, or the search for one, in a town where a hard winter meant fewer jobs going and more men chasing each one. William Gear, at 82, the oldest person in the row, was inside his own home, past the years of daily labour, living out an ordinary morning in the place he had likely lived for a very long time. None of them could see what was happening above their own roofs. The angle of the hill and the position of the cottages meant the overhanging shelf of snow was quite literally out of sight from ground level directly beneath it. You would have had to stand back, away from the row, and look up and across to see the pale mass hanging over the edge of Cliffe Hill at all. From inside a kitchen or bent over a fire or minding a 2-year-old, there was nothing to see. There was only the cold, the wind against the windows, and the ordinary work of getting through a winter morning 2 days after Christmas, with the pudding perhaps not quite finished, and the holly still tacked above the door. Outside, the wind had not eased. It had been driving snow against the same stretch of hillside for 3 days without real interruption, and whatever fragile equilibrium had held the cornice in place through Christmas Eve and Christmas Day was by the morning of the 27th close to its limit. The men who had seen snow slipping into the timber yard the evening before had gone home and gone to bed without raising any fresh alarm, because nothing more had happened that night to suggest the hour had arrived. The hill gave no further sign. It simply held through the small hours, carrying a weight it could not carry indefinitely until it could not carry it any longer. At approximately 10:15 that morning, the mass of snow above Boulder Row separated from the hillside entirely. It did not creep or slide in any way that would have given the people below it a warning they could act on. It broke away as a single body and began to fall, gathering speed across the full 330 feet between the lip of Cliffe Hill and the row of cottages at its foot. Whatever sound accompanied that fall, whatever anyone heard in the seconds before it struck, no one who could describe it in useful detail lived close enough, or survived clearly enough, to leave a record of the noise itself. What the record does preserve is the account of what the mass did when it arrived at the bottom. According to the Sussex Weekly Advertiser, printed in the aftermath and drawing on witnesses close enough to see it happen, the falling snow struck the houses first at the base, heaving them upwards, and then broke over them like a gigantic wave. That is the phrase the paper used, a gigantic wave, and it is worth taking seriously as a description rather than a flourish, because it describes something specific, not a gentle burying, not snow settling gradually over a rooftop, but a moving mass striking a fixed structure with the force of a genuine impact, lifting it, and then closing over the top of it. 7 cottages, home a moment before to roughly 15 people, went from standing structures to a single unbroken field, of white in the time it takes to say the words. Afterwards, witnesses said, there was nothing but a mound of pure white where a street had stood. No walls, no roof line, no sign from a distance that Boulder Row had ever been there at all. Inside that mound, 15 people were, in that instant, buried beneath a depth of packed snow, far beyond what any one person could dig through unaided, in a cold severe enough that survival itself became a race against time as much as against the weight above them. The formal cause of death for those who did not survive it was suffocation. That fact is stated once plainly, because it is what happened, and then the story must move to what came next, because what came next is where the people of Lewes and the people trapped beneath their own homes showed what they were capable of. Word travelled through Lewes within minutes, in the way word travels through a small town when something has gone badly wrong at its edge. Men left their own houses, their own breakfasts, their own work, and went straight to South Street, where the shape of the disaster was at first almost impossible to read. There was no row of houses to search room by room. There was a single unbroken slope of white, where 7 front doors had stood an hour before, and somewhere beneath it, 15 people, some of them children, one of them not yet 3 years old. The first problem the rescuers faced was one of simple tools: digging by hand through packed, wind-hardened snow that had been compressed by its own fall from a height of 330 feet, was slow, and the men who arrived first had little more than their bare hands and whatever kitchen implements could be grabbed on the way out of a door. A local ironmonger opened his stock and supplied shovels, and that single decision, made in the first confused minutes, likely did more to determine how many people came out alive than any single other act that day. Shovels arrived. Men organised themselves, without any formal instruction from any office in the town, into relays, working in shifts so that no one man exhausted himself uselessly against a wall of snow that would still be there in another hour, regardless of how hard any one person dug. They worked without knowing, at first, precisely where within the buried mass each cottage had stood, or where within each cottage its occupants were most likely to be. Snow does not preserve the outline of the rooms it buries. Every shovelful had to be dug on an estimate, a guess built from where the walls had last been seen standing, corrected as the diggers went and began, gradually, to strike timber, then furniture, then the first signs of the people they were looking for. The first survivors were reached within the opening hours of the search, pulled out cold, shaken, and in at least one case with limbs broken by the initial impact, but alive. Word of each successful recovery would have moved back through the crowd gathered at the edge of the site, the way any piece of good news moves through people, standing in the cold together, waiting. By the middle of the afternoon, roughly 6 hours after the collapse, the diggers had reached and recovered 14 of the estimated 15 people who had been inside Boulder Row that morning. Among the survivors were Jeremiah Rook, the young labourer, and Fanny Sherlock found, along with her granddaughter. The child, 2-year-old Fanny Boakes, was lifted out unharmed in the white dress she'd been wearing that morning, a dress that would still exist nearly 2 centuries later, kept in a collection in Lewes, its survival as improbable in its own quiet way as the child's had been. One person remained unaccounted for. 14-year-old John Bridgman was still beneath the snow, and the men digging for him did not know, as the afternoon light began to fail and the cold deepened further, whether they were still conducting a rescue or had begun, without anyone saying so aloud, something closer to a recovery. They kept digging anyway. They had already proven 14 times over that day that the snow did not necessarily mean what it looked like it meant. So they kept working the same relay system that had pulled the others out, shovel by shovel, through a 5th hour and then a 6th, past the point where anyone could have blamed them for stopping until first light. It was roughly 7 hours after the collapse, well into the evening, that the diggers finally reached him. John Bridgman was alive. He had suffered fractured legs and severe exhaustion, and the men who pulled him free that evening had been digging in relays since shortly after 10 o'clock that morning. He was the last person recovered from Boulder Row, and he was recovered alive, which is a sentence worth letting stand on its own, because it did not have to be true. And for 7 hours, nobody digging in that cold could have promised anyone that it would be. Local surgeons attended to the injured as they came out, working in whatever shelter could be arranged close to the site, treating broken bones and severe cold in men, women, and children pulled from a collapse that had given no warning of its own timing to anyone still inside. When it came, 8 of the 15 did not survive to be treated at all. Their bodies were recovered in the same operation that saved the other 7, laid out with whatever dignity the circumstances allowed, and prepared for burial in the days that followed. The town's response did not end with the digging. A cutting was made through the snow-choked road to allow the coffins of the 8 dead to be carried the roughly 1.5 kilometres to the parish church at South Malling, where they were buried together in a single communal grave, rather than separately across the churchyard. It is a detail that says something about both the scale of the loss and the practical limits a small town faced in the depth of its hardest winter in living memory. 8 neighbours, buried as one, because that was what the ground and the season allowed. Almost immediately, the town turned to the only mechanism available to it for making the survivors and the bereaved whole again. There was no company to sue, no landlord to compel, no institution whose negligence could be established and billed. What Lewes did instead was open a public subscription, asking anyone in the town and beyond who could give something to give it, and the town answered. £394, 5 shillings and sixpence was raised in total. After the costs of the operation itself were met, £193 was distributed directly to the survivors and the bereaved families to replace clothing, furniture, and whatever else a household needs and had just lost beneath its own roof. A further £75 was set aside in a savings fund specifically for the children left orphaned or injured by the collapse. A fund built not by any office of government, but by the ordinary generosity of people who had, in most cases, never met the families they were giving to. No coroner's inquest into the collapse survives in any record that has been found. Nor, so far as any surviving record shows, did a public inquiry sit to examine why a shelf of snow 20 feet deep had been allowed to gather above an inhabited street, or why no one in any official capacity in Lewes had the authority or the instruction to look at that hillside and order the row beneath it emptied before the 27th of December rather than after. That absence is itself worth sitting with, because it tells you something true about where accountability lived in a case like this one, and where it did not. In an industrial disaster, a mining explosion, a factory fire, a bridge collapse, there is almost always a defendant waiting to be found, an owner, an engineer, a foreman who signed off on a shortcut. The law by the 1830s already had some familiarity with holding such men to account, however imperfectly. Boulder Row offered no such figure. The hill was not owned by a company that had built beneath it recklessly. There was no factory inspector whose job it should have been to walk the base of Cliffe Hill and assess it as a hazard, because the very idea that a hillside itself needed inspecting, the way a boiler or a mine shaft needed inspecting, simply did not exist yet as a category of official responsibility. Snow falling from the sky was understood as an act of nature. A cornice breaking away from a hillside and falling on a row of houses was understood, if it was reasoned about at all, in much the same way as weather, not as a hazard that a competent authority ought to have foreseen and mitigated. That is where the deeper, harder truth of this disaster sits, and it is worth stating plainly rather than dressing it up. The people of Boulder Row were not failed by a company that broke a rule. They were failed by the absence of any rule at all, by a state and a town that had not yet developed the concept that where the poor were permitted to live could itself be a matter of public safety, rather than simply a matter of what they could afford. Robert Hyam had understood, instinctively and correctly, that the ground beneath that hill had become dangerous. No office in Lewes, no branch of government in London, had built any structure that could have told him he was right before the fact, or acted on it if he had gone to them. The only accountability mechanism the town possessed was the one it built for itself after the fact: the subscription, the relief fund, the savings account for the orphan children. It was decent. It was, by the standards of the age, generous. It was also, unmistakably, compensation rather than prevention, arriving after 8 people were already dead rather than before. It is worth being honest, too, about what has not survived in any record consulted on this event, rather than filling the gap with invention. No inquiry, no coroner's finding, no parliamentary inquiry. None of it appears to have happened, and none of it should be assumed to have happened simply because a disaster of this scale seems to demand one. Sometimes the absence of a formal process is itself the finding. In this case, the absence tells you that 1836 England had, as yet, no institutional language for what had happened at Boulder Row. It had a hillside, a winter, a warning partly heeded, and a town left to grieve and to rebuild without a villain to blame, and without a single reform to point to that would keep the next Boulder Row from being built the same way, in the same kind of place, for the same reason. No Act of Parliament followed the Lewes Avalanche. No building code was written because of it. No office was created to inspect hillsides above English towns, then or for a very long time afterwards. If you are looking for the moment this disaster changed the law, you will not find it, because it did not happen. That is not a gap in the research. It is the truth of the case, and it says something honest about how selectively history assigns its lasting consequences. Some disasters produce an Act of Parliament with a name still spoken today, and some disasters produce nothing but a grave, a fund, and a town that chooses, on its own initiative and with no requirement from anyone, to remember. What Lewes built instead of a law was memory, and it built it in a form that has lasted for nearly 2 centuries in ways that outlast most Acts of Parliament. In 1840, 4 years after the collapse, a public house was built directly on the site where Boulder Row had stood, on South Street, and it was given a name that made its purpose unmistakable to anyone who walked past it: the Snowdrop. Not a name chosen for prettiness alone, though a snowdrop is a fitting enough flower for a story about snow and about the delicate return of life after a hard season. It was chosen because everyone in Lewes, in 1840, still knew exactly what had happened on that spot 4 years before, and the town wanted a building there that said so permanently to everyone who came after. That pub still stands today, still trades under that name, on the same ground where 15 people were buried alive on an ordinary morning 2 days after Christmas. Every person who orders a drink there is standing, whether they know it or not, on the exact footprint of Boulder Row. A mile away, at the parish church of South Malling, where the 8 dead were carried through a cutting dug in the snow and buried together in a single grave, a marble tablet was raised on the north wall, funded by the same subscription that paid for the survivors' relief. It carries the 8 names in full: William Gear, 82, Phoebe Barndon, 45, Mary Taylor, 42, Susan Hayward, 34, Maria Bridgman, 28, Jane Boakes, 25, Joseph Wood, 15, Mary Bridgman, 11, 2 children and 6 adults, the oldest 82 years into a life, and the youngest just 11 years into hers, carved together into the same slab of marble because they died together beneath the same fall of snow. The tablet has stood on that wall for nearly 200 years, through every restoration and repair the church itself has needed, because a church congregation, generation after generation, kept choosing not to take it down. And there is a third object, smaller than a public house and quieter than a marble tablet, but in its own way just as eloquent. The white dress that 2-year-old Fanny Boakes was wearing when she was lifted, unharmed, from beneath the snow that had killed 8 of her neighbours, survives today in the collection of the Sussex Archaeological Society, associated with the Anne of Cleves House Museum in Lewes. It is not kept on public display. It is held for its own preservation, too fragile now for regular exposure to light and handling. But it exists, folded away in careful storage. The actual garment a small child was wearing on the morning her home disappeared beneath a hillside, and it has been kept deliberately for very nearly 200 years by a town that has never quite let this story go. That refusal to let go is, in the end, the only reform this disaster produced. It changed no building code and created no inspectorate. It did not stop other towns from building cheap housing hard against unstable ground, and it did not in any legal sense, make the poor of England safer from the particular danger that killed 8 of their neighbours in Lewes. What it did was smaller, and in its own way harder to dismiss. It made a town choose, deliberately and repeatedly, across nearly 2 centuries, to keep the names of 8 ordinary people and the memory of the 7 who lived somewhere the living could still find them. A pub with a name that will not let you forget what stood there before it. A tablet with 8 names, cut into stone, that a congregation has never once considered removing. A child's dress folded and kept when it would have been just as easy, and far less trouble, to let it fall apart or throw it away. The winter that produced the fall over Boulder Row did not confine itself to Lewes. Across England, the winter of 1836 into 1837 would be remembered afterwards as one of the most severe in living memory, a season of blocked roads, frozen rivers, and snowfall heavy enough to disrupt the ordinary business of an entire country for weeks at a stretch. Mail coaches were delayed. Market towns found themselves cut off from one another by drifts that swallowed entire roads. It was, in other words, a winter that every household in England that year had some story to tell about, whether it was a burst pipe, a lost roof slate, or simply weeks confined indoors by cold that would not break. Lewes was not unusual in suffering through that winter. It was unusual only in what that winter did to one particular hillside above one particular street, and to the 15 people who happened to be living beneath it when the accumulated weight of 3 days of gale-driven snow finally exceeded what the chalk and the frozen crust could hold. That distinction matters because it is easy from 2 centuries away to imagine Boulder Row as somehow exceptional in its poverty or its danger, a uniquely unlucky corner of an otherwise safe town. It was not exceptional. Housing built cheaply against the base of a hill, on ground too marginal or too undesirable for anyone with better options to want it, existed in dozens of English towns that same winter, and most of those towns got through the season without a single roof failing beneath the snow. What separated Lewes from every other town that endured the same weather was not that its poor were housed more dangerously than anyone else's. It was the specific geometry of one hillside, one exposed lip of chalk catching the wind at exactly the angle needed to build a cornice, rather than simply a drift sitting directly above 7 homes rather than open field. Chance, in other words, decided which town's hard winter became a headline and which town's hard winter simply became a story told afterwards about how cold that Christmas had been. That is not a comfortable thought, and it was almost certainly not one that occurred to very many people in Lewes in the days immediately after the collapse, when the more immediate business was digging, burying, and providing for the survivors. But it sits underneath everything that happened at Boulder Row, and it is worth naming plainly. Nothing about that row of cottages, or the families living in them, marks them out in advance as the household fate had selected. They were simply the row of poor houses that happened to stand beneath the one stretch of hillside, where the wind, over 3 days, built something the chalk could not hold. Every other row of poor houses built the same way, against the same kind of slope, in the same terrible winter, simply happened to be standing somewhere else. The workhouse that Boulder Row's families weighed against the risk of staying in their homes was not a shelter in any comfortable sense of the word. It was, in the plain understanding of the labouring poor of that period, a place of last resort, dreaded precisely because it meant surrendering the shape of an ordinary household, a family's own roof, its own fire, its own way of managing a hard season, for the rules of an institution not built with anyone's comfort in mind. People avoided it unless they were, in the word used at the time, desperate. It was not a place anyone walked into lightly, and it was not designed to be. It was designed to be the last door anyone opened, chosen only when every other option, however dangerous, had already been weighed and found less frightening by comparison. This is the detail that gives Robert Hyam's warning its full weight. He was not asking people to choose between a dangerous home and a comfortable one. He was asking them to weigh a danger they could not fully see or measure against a certainty they understood completely, that walking through a workhouse door meant the end of the household as they knew it, for as long as they remained inside it. The workhouse had, by the reputation it carried among people, like the families of Boulder Row, already earned a fear severe enough that a household could weigh its terms against an overhanging cliff of snow and, in more than one recorded case, choose the cliff. It is worth being precise about what that decision says and does not say about the people who made it. It does not say they underestimated the danger. Robert Hyam had made the danger plain enough that he put his hands on two women and tried to walk them out himself. It says instead that 1836, England had built a system of relief so punishing in its design that it could lose a straightforward contest against an unmeasured, unpredictable, natural hazard in the minds of people who had every reason to take both threats seriously. That is not a failing of the families in Boulder Row. It is a failing of a system of relief built to be feared, shaped by men who never had to make that particular choice themselves. On a cold morning, with a hillside, they could not see the underside of hanging above their children's beds. News of what had happened at Boulder Row did not stay confined to those who had witnessed it firsthand. The Sussex Weekly Advertiser's account of the collapse, with its description of houses struck at the base and heaved upward before the snow broke over them like a wave, carried the story to readers well beyond the town itself, in the way a disaster of this scale, striking between Christmas and the New Year, tended to hold a newspaper reader's attention. For a time, Boulder Row became a place people well outside Sussex had reason to know by name. The £394, 5 shillings and 6pence raised by public subscription was in the end the town's own answer to what had happened on its own street. Money given in the depth of Lewes's hardest winter in memory, by people whose own resources were already stretched by the same weather that had caused the disaster, so that 8 dead neighbours and the families of 7 survivors would not be left with nothing beyond their grief. It is worth noting too what does not appear anywhere in the coverage of the day, because it tells you something about how thin the concept of institutional accountability still was in 1836. Nothing in the record of the day, so far as it survives, called for an inquiry into why Boulder Row had been permitted to stand where it stood. Nothing demanded that Parliament examine the safety of housing built beneath exposed hillsides elsewhere in the country. The disaster was received at the time as a tragedy of nature and a triumph of local heroism in the rescue that followed it, not as a scandal requiring a villain. That framing, uncontested at the time, is itself part of why no reform ever followed. A story told as an act of God rarely produces an act of Parliament. Nobody in Lewes in December of 1836 would have used the word avalanche to describe what they feared might happen to them, because, in the English understanding of that word, avalanches were a phenomenon of the Alps, not of Sussex. They belonged to Switzerland, to mountain passes and high peaks, to a landscape entirely unlike the gentle chalk downland that surrounded a market town on the River Ouse. Cliffe Hill was not a mountain. It was, by any ordinary description, a hill, the kind of rise a person might walk up on a Sunday afternoon without a second thought, 500 feet at its highest point, covered in grass and scrub in an ordinary year rather than glaciers or permanent snowpack. The very idea that such a hill could produce anything resembling the catastrophes reported from the Alps would have struck most people in Lewes if they had considered it, at all, as faintly absurd. That absence of any local concept of the danger is, in its own way, as important as any warning that was or was not given. Robert Hyam did not need a scientific term for what he feared. He needed only to look at the shape of the snow building along the top of the hill and judge correctly that it looked wrong, that it was accumulating in a way and to a depth that made him uneasy enough to act on his own initiative, without any official language to describe what he was worried about, and without any professional body he could report it to, even if he had wanted to. There was no meteorological office to consult, no engineer trained in the behaviour of snow loads on an exposed slope, because in England, in 1836, nobody had yet had reason to develop that expertise on this side of the channel. The mechanism that broke over Boulder Row that morning, the physics of a cornice separating from a hillside under its own accumulated weight, was already reasonably well understood in the mountainous regions of continental Europe, where such events were common enough to have their own vocabulary and their own precautions. It had simply never occurred to anyone that the same physics could operate on an English chalk down, in a country that thought of heavy snow as an inconvenience rather than a hazard capable of the kind of violence more commonly associated with a rockfall. That gap between what was already known somewhere in the world and what had ever reached Sussex is worth naming plainly, because it is a different kind of failure from the ones this channel more often uncovers. It is not a warning suppressed by a company protecting its profits, and it is not a regulation ignored by an official cutting corners. It is simply a distance, geographic and intellectual, between a danger that engineers in the Alps already had a name for, and a hillside in Sussex where nobody had ever thought to ask whether the same danger could exist. Robert Hyam saw the danger, without the vocabulary for it, and acted anyway. That, in its own quiet way, makes what he did more remarkable, not less. He did not need an expert to tell him the hill above Boulder Row had become something to fear. He simply looked at it and believed his own eyes and went from door to door to say so. In the whole of recorded British history, no single avalanche has ever killed more people than the one that fell on Boulder Row that morning. Britain is not, on the whole, a country built for avalanches. Its hills are gentler than the Alps or the Rockies, its snowfalls generally lighter and less sustained, and the conditions capable of producing a genuine, fatal cornice collapse are rare enough that most English counties have never recorded one at all. That rarity is precisely why the Lewes fall has held its place, for very nearly 2 centuries now, as the deadliest event of its kind ever to occur on British soil. It is not a record that arises from any particular scale of engineering failure, the way a mining disaster's toll might be measured against the size of the pit. It arises from an unusual convergence, a specific hillside shape capable of holding a cornice, a specific run of gale-driven snowfall, severe enough to build one to a dangerous depth, and a specific row of homes positioned directly beneath the one stretch of slope where that combination occurred. Other British winters, before and since, have brought snow as heavy and wind as fierce. None of them found quite the same hillside standing over quite the same row of homes, with quite the same absence of any means to move those homes to safer ground in time. That singularity is worth pausing on, because it means Boulder Row does not sit within any established pattern of disaster that Britain later learned to guard against. There was no second Lewes to prompt reform after this one, no repeated toll that eventually forced Parliament's hand the way repeated mining explosions eventually forced safety legislation into being. A hazard that occurs once, however severe its toll, rarely produces the sustained public pressure that a recurring hazard does. Mining disasters killed in smaller numbers, again and again, year after year, until the accumulated weight of repetition became impossible for any government to ignore indefinitely. Lewes killed 8 people once, in a form of disaster so unfamiliar to England that it barely registered as a category of danger at all, and then it did not happen again, anywhere in the country, at anything like the same scale. The rarity that makes the event so exceptional today is the same rarity that ensured it produced no lasting institutional response in its own time. Around the men digging in relays, a second quieter effort was underway, carried mostly by people whose names the record does not preserve at all. Women from elsewhere in Lewes came to the edge of the site carrying blankets, warm drinks, and whatever dry clothing could be spared, aware that anyone pulled alive from beneath that snow would come out soaked through and dangerously cold in a season already cold enough to kill on its own without any snowfall at all. There would have been little formal organisation to this. No parish office issued instructions for it. It happened because a crowd of ordinary townspeople, standing at the edge of a disaster they could not otherwise help with, did the only useful thing available to them, which was to make sure that anyone brought out alive did not then lose that life to the cold while waiting for a surgeon. The crowd itself would have grown through the day, as word spread further into the surrounding villages and more people made their way towards South Street to see, to help if they could, or simply to stand witness to something none of them had any precedent for. A market town the size of Lewes did not have crowds of that kind gather without cause. People would have stood for hours in the same bitter cold that had caused the disaster in the first place, watching the relay of diggers' work, watching each recovery, alive or otherwise, carried away from the site, counting, the way any crowd counts in circumstances like these, toward a number nobody wanted to reach and nobody could yet know. By the time John Bridgman was finally freed, 7 hours after the collapse and well into the darkness of a December evening, that crowd would have thinned with the fading light and the deepening cold, but it would not have emptied. Some number of people, family, neighbours, the men who had been digging since morning and would not leave until the last person was accounted for, remained at the site until the work was finished. There is no record of who exactly stood there at the end, in the dark, watching the final stretch of digging by whatever lantern light the town could bring to bear on a hillside collapse. Nobody had planned for, and nobody had the proper equipment to manage. But someone did. A rescue conducted entirely by volunteers over 7 continuous hours in weather severe enough to have caused the disaster in the first place does not happen without people willing to stay past the point of comfort, past the point of expectation, simply because the alternative was walking away while a 14-year-old boy was still somewhere beneath the snow. Through the night that followed, once the last of the living and the dead had been brought up out of the snow, the men who had spent the day digging did not simply disband and go home to their own fires. There was still the matter of the 7 empty foundations, the personal effects that could be recovered before the site froze harder still, and the practical business of a town figuring out, in the space of a single, terrible day, how it would house, clothe, and feed the families who no longer had a roof at all. Some of the survivors were taken in that first night by neighbours in other parts of Lewes who had homes and beds to spare, an informal, unrecorded network of hospitality that did for the displaced what no institution in the town was yet built to do. It was the same instinct that had put shovels into untrained hands that morning and blankets into the arms of women who had never been asked to nurse strangers before. Ordinary people filling, without being told to, the exact gap that no office, no law, and no company existed to fill. It is worth returning now to the shape of that single morning. At 10:15 on the 27th of December, 1836, a hillside that nobody in Sussex had ever thought to fear let go of 20 feet of snow it could no longer hold, and in the time it takes to draw a breath, a street of 7 homes became a single, unbroken mound of white. There was no war that morning. There was no earthquake, no flood, no act of terrorism, nothing that England, in that century, had yet learned to guard against. There was only a hillside, a fortnight of merciless weather, and a choice made by ordinary people with almost nothing to choose between, to stay inside the only homes they had. 8 of them did not come home. William Gear, 82 years old, and Phoebe Barnden, and Mary Taylor, and Susan Hayward, and Maria Bridgman, and Jane Boakes, and 15-year-old Joseph Wood and 11-year-old Mary Bridgman are buried together at South Malling, under a tablet that still carries all 8 of their names, because a congregation, generation after generation, has simply never taken it down. 7 more came out of that snow alive, the last of them a 14-year-old boy named John Bridgman, pulled free after 7 hours of digging by men who did not know, until the moment they reached him, whether they were still conducting a rescue at all. A 2-year-old girl named Fanny Boakes came out of the snow that day too, unharmed, in a white dress that a town has kept folded away and cared for ever since, as if letting it fall apart would be one more thing lost that nobody could bear to lose. Nothing was legislated because of what happened at Boulder Row. No inspector was appointed, no code was written, no Act of Parliament carries its name. If you go looking for the moment this disaster changed the law, you will not find it, and that absence is itself part of the story. What Lewes built instead was smaller and, in its own way, harder to dismiss. A public house raised on the exact ground where the row had stood, named the Snowdrop, so that nobody who drank there could entirely forget what the name was marking, standing to this day. A tablet that has outlasted every argument for taking it down. A dress kept nearly 2 centuries past the morning it was worn. A man named Robert Hyam walked that street in the days before the fall and told its people, as plainly as he knew how, that the hill above them had become something to fear. Some believed him and left. Others weighed his warning against a workhouse door and chose to stay, and it is not their judgment that failed that morning. It was a country that had not yet learned to protect the people who had the least power to protect themselves. 2 centuries on, the pub still stands where Boulder Row once stood, and the tablet still carries 8 names on a church wall a mile away, and somewhere in careful storage, a small white dress is still being kept by people who never knew the girl who wore it, for no reason except that a town decided, quietly and without any law requiring it, that 8 ordinary people who never asked to become a story should not be allowed to become a forgotten one.